First, it says the U.S. should cease its hostilities against Iran. This is completely backwards. The U.S. is not actively conducting hostilities against Iran, but Iran has been actively conducting hostilities against us and our troops for decades. If you just look at the long, bloody list with thousands of Americans dead and wounded, Marine barracks in Lebanon, Khobar towers in Saudi Arabia, Soleimani, deadly IDs in Iraq. Second, the broader AUMF of Senator Kaine dramatically limits our ability to protect these very forces from future attacks, which we know the Iranians are planning. Close to half the forces in Iraq right now are Alaska-based military forces. Our friends and neighbors in Alaska, I want to make sure they're protected.
The senator's time has expired.
My amendment does that by making sure the president has clear authority to protect our troops.
Who gives time in opposition?
Madam President.
Senator from Utah.
Madam President, I have great respect for my distinguished colleague from Alaska. I appreciate his service to our country and his thoughts today. I stand in opposition to his amendment because if there's one thing that we don't need right now, it's anything else that would give more authority to the military-industrial complex to start and finish wars without authorization from Congress. Anytime we introduce additional ambiguity into a field that's already ripe with ambiguity, given the inherent tension between ambiguity surrounding the inherent Article 2 Commander-in-Chief power and the Article 1 power that Congress has to declare war, we run into problems. This would open up that ambiguity. The legislation that we're addressing here, this resolution is bipartisan. It has as its object to clarify that for future offensive action, we need congressional authorization. We've been lied to by the Pentagon for years regarding a war that's gone on 2 decades. That's long enough. We don't want to create additional ambiguities. We don't want any more wars without the people's elected representatives being able to debate it. Madam President, I move to table the Sullivan Amendment, and I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Height-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Jones, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Loeffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Bennett, Booker, Cardin, Collins, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Feinstein, Harris, Hassan, Hirono, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Murray, Paul, Peters, Reed, Rosen, Sanders, Sinema, Smith, Tester, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Warren, and Wyden. Ms. Stabenow. Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Capito, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Gardner, Grassley, Hawley, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Inhofe, Johnson, Kennedy, Loeffler, McSally, Murkowski, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rubio, Sass, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sullivan, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Cassidy, no. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Jones, aye. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Langford, no. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Graham, no. Mr. Daines, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Shelby, no. Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Rounds, no. Mr. McConnell, no. Mr. Burr, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Cornyn, no. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? Seeing none, the ayes are 51, the nays are 49, and the motion is agreed to.
Madam President.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Madam President, I think that President Trump's decision to take out General Soleimani was the boldest defense policy decision of his presidency to date. Even in a single strike, the president defended American lives and showed Iran and terrorism, and most importantly, spilling American blood is something that will come at a price. Unlike what we've gone through from the predecessor, the red line didn't mean anything, it means something. Now everybody knows it. And the result, we're now in the best negotiating position with Iran since 1979, and Iran's escalation, which includes attacks on tankers, Saudi Arabian oil facilities, and the killing of an American citizen. It's ended, at least for now. Yet some Democrats would have you believe a vote for a war powers resolution, pretending as though the president is rushing to war. It's just not happening. But the facts are not there. There is no war with Iran. An airstrike is not a war. Punishing Iran for killing an American citizen is not a war. Nor has the Soleimani strike started a new war, as Democrats would have you believe. It just hadn't happened. And it's been 3 weeks now since the Democrats first tried to vote on this resolution. And during those 3 weeks, nothing has happened. Let me just repeat that. Nothing's happened. There have been no new Iranian attacks against us, and we have not attacked them. How can anyone claim that we're at some kind of a war? Moreover, nobody wants war with Iran. The president has made it very clear he doesn't want war with Moran. With Iran. And in fact, the president's decision to eliminate Soleimani has made war much less likely because it showed Iran that its terrorism would come at a price. And that wasn't the case before. So despite this success, today we're debating whether we want to tie the hands of our commander-in-chief or any commander-in-chief to respond when American lives are put at risk, as the Constitution gives them the authority to do. Well, I want to be sure all of my colleagues are crystal clear on this, exactly this war powers resolution means, what it will actually do. The resolution calls the president to terminate the use of American armed forces for hostilities against Iraq. But there are no hostilities against Iran. There is no war with Iran. The resolution calling for the termination of hostilities against California would be just about to have the same effect. Practically speaking, this vote will do nothing. It's nonsense, but we should be very concerned about the symbolic effect this vote will have. This will send a very damaging message to Iran. The Iranians will interpret a vote in favor of this resolution as tying the president's hands, and that would lead Iran to believe once again that it can get by with anything. We remember that wasn't that long ago. They really believe that. Now, nobody wants that. Congress doesn't want it, the White House didn't want it, and certainly not the American people. So I don't know why we're even debating a resolution that could make war more likely when we're trying to do just the opposite. But if the Democrats insist on tying the president's hands, then the least we can do is minimize the damage. So while I urge my colleagues to vote against this resolution, I also urge them to support amendments to minimize the damage. And I want to comment briefly on the amendment offered by the ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, my friend and the gentleman from Rhode Island. He is correct to highlight the traumatic brain injuries that a number of our troops suffered during the January 8th Iranian strike on Iraq. We understand that. And however, I would like to clarify, I believe that we were not misled in this at all. Mild TBIs can only be confirmed through MRI scans, okay? And the Department of the Defense implemented its screening procedure properly and made sure that all troops in the vicinity of the strike were screened. I think we need to understand that. If all of this was done, and it's as if that wasn't done at all. And once those results were made available, the Department of Defense notified the public in a press release. It then briefed our committee, the committee that I chair. I therefore want to commend the Department of Defense for taking all the right measures to protect our forces during the Iranian strikes and for appropriately screening our forces for after effects. And this is why I think it's extremely important that we vote this resolution down, even as it's amended now. It will signal to the Iranians that there is no price for aggression. It will undermine deterrence, and it will leave our troops, diplomats, and citizens vulnerable. And nobody wants that. And with that, I'll yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator for Virginia.
may I inquire if we're in a quorum call?
We are not.
Mr. President, I rise to speak with respect to final passage of Senate Joint Resolution 68, which will be the next item of business before us. And I'll speak briefly because I've been on the floor about this a few times in the last week or two. First, I want to thank my colleagues for this process, including the President. It has been a very collaborative process with a lot of dialogue, a lot of listening, a lot of changes and amendments and back and forth since early January. And my colleagues, however they voted on things that I hoped they might support me on, were very, very willing to dialogue and ask hard questions, and I understood why people were where they were. So I just want to thank the body for it. And I also note what a cool thing it is to actually have a bunch of amendment votes on the floor. I hope we might do more on other items. This is an issue that is extremely important to this body, and it's extremely important to me. And of the variety of issues, I didn't serve in the military. Why would it be important to me? But having a child in the military and coming from a state that is so connected to the military, I just have been nearly obsessed with this issue since about 2002. Never knew that I'd have an opportunity to work on it as a United States Senator, but when I came here in 2012, I started to look for colleagues on both sides of the aisle and both houses who would stand for the proposition that war is the most solemn responsibility we have, and it cannot be outsourced to anyone. I was willing to stand up to a friend, a Democratic president, and challenge him when he was undertaking military action without coming to Congress. And I've done the same with President Trump, but with no disrespect to the office. I want an Article II president who will inhabit fully the Article II powers of the Office of Commander-in-Chief. But what I've hoped for since I came is an Article I branch that would fully inhabit the Article I powers that are vested only in Congress. And for that reason, I put the resolution forward and worked with Mr. President, you and others, to try to make sure that the resolution was bipartisan. It's quite not only bipartisan, but folks from different parts of the political spectrum and different parts of the country, and new members and veteran members have come together to say, after many decades of abdicating responsibility under presidents of both parties and under majorities of both parties in both houses, it's time for Congress to take this so very seriously. And that's why I'll be voting in favor of the resolution and encouraging other colleagues to do the same. Last thing I just want to say is this, and I talked about these two young men briefly yesterday on the floor, but I just am struck by their stories. The last two men who were killed in combat for the United States in the 19-year-long war against terrorists that was sparked by America's righteous outrage over the attack of 9/11 were two sergeants first class, Xavier Gutierrez and Antonio Rodriguez. They're both from the Southwest, one from San Antonio, one from Las Cruces, New Mexico. They were both killed last week in Afghanistan by an insider attack. Somebody who was wearing a uniform, potentially a member of the Afghan National Security Forces or posing as one, the security forces that we've invested billions and billions of dollars in training and equipping, $45 billion this year alone. Someone wearing that uniform, an ally of the United States, turned a weapon on these two gentlemen and killed them. I read their bios, and I was just so struck by their stories. They're 28 years old, which means they were 9 years old when 9/11 happened and when Congress passed the war authorization under whose terms they were then serving when they lost their lives in Afghanistan. So they really never knew in their life anything but war. By the time they were 9 years old, the nation was at war. And 19 years later, we're still in the same war, and that authorization has been used now all over the globe to engage in military activity virtually in so many countries on so many continents. They never knew anything but war. Just to say a word about each of them. Sergeant Gutierrez is the young man, 28-year-old from San Antonio. Sergeant Gutierrez's grandfather was an aviator in World War II who was shot down and imprisoned in a POW camp in Germany. His name was Mr. Ortiz, and he was then liberated when the Russians liberated that POW camp. That was his grandfather. Sergeant Gutierrez's dad was a Marine during the Vietnam era, and Sergeant Gutierrez was born in Jacksonville, North Carolina, near the Lejeune base in North Carolina. All he wanted to do was serve his country. So he joined the junior ROTC program at his local high school because I want to be like my grandfather and I want to be like my dad. And he served, by all accounts, in such a wonderful way. This was his third deployment, one in Iraq and one in Afghanistan previously. And this was his third deployment. And he leaves behind a wife, Gabby, and 4 children ages 2 to 7. Sergeant Rodriguez was from Las Cruces, New Mexico. He also leaves behind a wife, Ronaline, no children, but a lot of devoted family. Mr. President, when I read this in the news, I thought it was a misprint. This was Sergeant Rodriguez's 11th deployment to Afghanistan. He was only 28 years old. Probably didn't come into the military till he was 18, but he was Special Forces. Those deployments tend to be often more frequent and maybe not as long in duration, but think about it. 10 times in Afghanistan, and then on the 11th deployment, he gave his life. The sacrifice is just kind of staggering for me to contemplate. Staggering for me to contemplate. I will just conclude and say this. I know that everybody in this chamber goes to VA hospitals to visit, and I have 3 VA hospitals in Virginia. I was in one in Hampton last Friday. We do this because we want to see our great care providers. We want to talk to our veterans, get inspired by their stories of resilience, see cutting-edge treatments and technologies, and often those visits are empowering and inspiring visits. But one thing you will always feel when you leave a visit to a VA hospital, and I felt this way when I left the VA in Hampton last Friday afternoon, the enduring consequences of war. When I was visiting the mental health unit, when I was visiting the women's clinic that now deals with the increasing number of women's veterans, what you grapple with is the enduring consequences of war. Under the best of circumstances, when we get it right, when we win, there's still horrible consequences of war in people's health and people's life and in the life and health of the caregivers and friends of those who serve. Because those consequences are so momentous and so enduring, those of us in this body, and maybe especially those of us in this body who didn't wear the uniform and didn't serve, we have a special obligation to make sure that we deliberate and deliberate carefully before we send troops into harm's way. The President of the United States, this president, and every president always needs the ability to defend the United States against imminent attack without asking for anybody's permission. I think the world knows we will do that. This body, though, is the body that needs to decide if we go on offense and engage in military action. And guess what? The world knows we'll do that too. Because when we took that vote on the war authorization in 2001, 18 years later, we still have tens of thousands of troops deployed. We have people who are still losing their lives. We're spending $45 billion a year in Afghanistan to preserve the gains that we've won. No one can question America's resolve. But this resolution is about a level of deliberation to match the sacrifice that we expect. The sacrifice is momentous. And so our deliberation should be careful. And that's what this bill is designed to do. And that's why I'm so proud to have worked on it with my colleagues. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator for Idaho.
Mr. President, I have 3 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of both the majority and minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you. Mr. President, fellow senators, we're about to vote on an important piece of legislation. Of course, it's a piece of legislation that will never become law, but nonetheless, it deserves our attention and certainly deserves serious consideration. We know 2 things as we approach this. Number one, under the Constitution, it is absolutely crystal clear that only Congress can declare war. Number 2, which is crystal clear, we know the President of the United States has the authority to defend the country. And finally, number 3, and this is very important as it relates to this, no one wants war with Iran. No one agrees that we should proceed to war with Iran. That is simply not the situation here today. There are constitutional questions here we know that we have to wrestle with, and they are difficult ones. It's important to note here, first of all, that the dispute that's been going on with Iran for a long, long time has really nothing to do with the Iranian people. We support the Iranian people. They have a long history, a proud tradition, and they deserve substantially better than what they're getting in leadership today. This is an important debate we're going to have today about war powers and the use of military force. One of the things also that's clear, but that muddies the water, and that is that there is no clear line of delineation between actual war and the use of kinetic force. As I said, it's important to have this debate. I really believe it should not be held in this context. It should be a policy that we're debating that is usable in all contexts. I've sat through hours, dozens of hours of debate on war powers, the war powers of the president. It's an age-old debate that's gone on since George Washington was president. It's a hard debate because these words were all written in the 18th century, and things were a lot clearer then. Things are much less clear today. These debates were long. There were many lawyers involved, and indeed, no conclusion can be reached. It's one of those areas I've come to the conclusion that the words that need to be written in order to clearly specify the place that the president occupies and the place that the Congress occupies is a very, very difficult one. There are things on this earth, and I really believe this may be one of them, where we know it when we see it, but we can't define it. We know war when we see it. We also know what is kinetic action in order to protect the people of the United States that's more isolated in the hands of the president doing a defensive measure. We know that when we see it. But defining the distinction between the two of when one blurs into the other is very, very difficult. The president needs the authority that he has to defend the United States. And it is clear that that authority comes from 3 buckets. Number one, it comes from the Article 2 of the United States Constitution. Number 2, it comes from the War Powers Act. And number 3, it comes from the AUMFs that have been passed by this body for some time. And Iran, as you're listening, understand that the president has that authority. He has specific authority from all of those buckets. Notwithstanding the arguments that are met here, that have been made here by some members of this body, the president unquestionably has those powers. This power has been used very sparingly by this president. Compared to the last administration, the numbers are really indeed striking. The drone action, the drone strikes that have been taken then and now, during the Obama administration, there were 540 of them over 8 years. In this particular administration, they are very, very few and far between and can only be described as a handful. This is a president who abhors the use of military force. I have had the opportunity to discuss it with him at length, and I've actually been in the room when he's been confronted with these questions and had to make the decisions. He is deeply moved by these kind of questions and understands how difficult they are. When he talks about how he has to write letters to the men and women who didn't come home, about having to make those phone calls, about having to go to Dover to receive the remains of our brave men and women who didn't make it home alive. He is deeply, deeply disturbed by these matters, and I can tell you, as I said, having been there, when he's had to make these decisions, that these weigh heavily on him. So, what are we doing here today? It certainly isn't to rein up this president. He has not used power willy-nilly, as I've indicated. It has been very, very sparingly that it's been used, in great contrast to the previous administration. Well, what we're doing here today is we are trying to get our arms around the question of when is it appropriate for the president to use military force. And we all have our ideas on that. We have the words that the Founding Fathers left us. And so we're going to debate it here today, and it's important. The unfortunate part about this is we're also sending a message to Iran. And Iran is listening. There is no question that they're listening to this debate. They're listening to what people are saying here on the floor of the Senate. And one of the messages that will come out of this, the way this is drawn, is that that the drafters of this want to send a message of appeasement to Iran. This has been tried. It hasn't worked. The last administration bent over backwards to offer appeasement to Iran, and they were greatly betrayed by it. And it was tried with the JCPOA, and it didn't work. And the reason it didn't work is we are not dealing with people here who are acting in good faith. What we need to do is we need to send a message of firmness and not weakness. And at the end of the day, when we're all done with this, there will be such a message. It needs to be a consistent and uniform message when it comes to messaging to Iran, when it comes to our messaging on our foreign policy as it relates to Iran. But it will not be this law that is before us, because it's going to be vetoed. We all know it's going to be vetoed. It takes a 2/3 majority to override that. It's not going to happen. And so the mixed message is there. Iran will listen to it, and the hardliners will take it one way, other people will take it the other, and that is not a good situation. But hopefully, we'll be able to lay this out in a way that they can read between the lines and get the message that is important. The president took action that people have criticized here that was difficult. It was a tough decision. It was a really bad guy, a guy who was worse than Osama bin Laden. He was the person who was executing Iran's malign policies in the world and in the region. His killings and loss of limb have become legendary in the world today. Whenever I see one of our young men or women that are missing an arm or a leg, they owe that to General Soleimani. He killed hundreds of people. He was responsible for the IED program that took the lives of so many and maimed so many of our men and women that were fighting in the Middle East. And he got to the point where he was wandering around really with impunity and not worried about what he was doing or that anybody was going to take any action against him. Well, let's look at the timeline over the last year. The Iranians started by blowing up oil tankers. Nothing was done about it. They attacked the Saudi oil fields where 100 Americans were working. Nothing was done about it. They took down a drone of ours over international space. Nothing was done about it. And finally, they ratcheted up over the fall 13 attacks on U.S. soldiers at U.S. bases in Iraq. These were our men and our women that we'd asked to go over there and push back against Iran's attempted infiltration into Iraq. 13 attacks they took. Finally, on one of those attacks, somebody was killed. And the president had already laid down a red line that if an American was killed, there was going to be a price to pay. They finally killed that person. They attacked our embassy in Baghdad and attempted to set it on fire. And so eventually, the president made the choice to do what he did. And this was in response to the continual pushing of the envelope from Iran and the miscalculations that Iran made. This man was traveling. General Soleimani was traveling. He had been traveling from place to place, putting in place final plans and coordination for the execution of an attack against American people. It was imminent. Now, you've heard my friends here say, "Oh no, it wasn't imminent. We listened to the intelligence." I sit on the Intelligence Committee. I sat through all of the briefings that were given that were at the secret level and the top secret level that were given to the people that are here in the body. I also sat through the ones that were given to the Intelligence Committee, which were compartmented and much more granular. There was no doubt that this man was planning an imminent attack to kill Americans. He didn't get the chance. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for what you did. Now, we've heard the argument here that it wasn't imminent. This person was substantially more imminent danger to the United States of America and to Americans than when Osama bin Laden was. But when the President of the United States, Barack Obama, took out Osama bin Laden, we all cheered it. In fact, we passed a resolution here, 100-0, commending the President of the United States for what he did. So today, Mr. President, you heard us pass such a resolution thanking you. Thank you, Mr. President, and farewell, General Soleimani. Iran, do not miscalculate and read what is happening here as capitulation or weakness or appeasement. It is not. It is a disagreement between this branch of government, the legislative branch, and our second branch of government, the executive branch, as to how we should defend ourselves. But make no mistake about it, we will defend ourselves. In America, we operate under the rule of law. This bill that's in front of us that we are debating today will not become law. It will not be part of the body of law which we live by. It will be vetoed. Iran, take note. If you continue on the path that you are on with your malign activities, it is going to take you to a very bad place. I'd urge a no vote. I understand how this is going to come out. I'll be standing here again to sustain the President's veto, and it will be sustained. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. President.
The senator for Idaho.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the 1:45 vote that was scheduled commence now.
Without objection. The clerk will read the joint resolution for the third time.
Senate Joint Resolution 68, to direct the removal of United States armed forces from hostilities against the Islamic Republic of Iran that have not been authorized by Congress.
The question occurs on the passage of S.J. Res. 68 as amended.
Mr. President, ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Bennett, Brown, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Collins, Cortez Masto, Durbin, Feinstein, Hassan, Jones, Kane, Leahy, Lee, Manchin, Murray, Paul, Reed, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Tester, Whitehouse, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Van Hollen, aye. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Barrasso, Blackburn, Blunt, Bozeman, Braun, Burr, Capito, Cornyn, Cotton, Kramer, Crapo, Daines, Enzi, Fisher, Gardner, Graham, Grassley, Hawley, Johnson, Kennedy, Langford, Loeffler, McSally, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Romney, Rounds, Rubio, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Shelby, Toomey, and Wicker. Mr. Sanders, aye. Ms. Ernst, no. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Hyde Smith, no. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Tillis, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Inhofe, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Udall, aye. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Sullivan, no. Mr. Merkley, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. King, aye. Mr. McConnell, no. Ms. Rosen, aye. Ms. Harris, aye. Mr. Peters, Mr. Peters, aye. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Cruz, no. Mr. Hoven, no. Mr. Sass, no. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Thune, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to change their vote? If not, the yeas are 55, the nays are 45. The joint resolution as amended is passed.
Mr. President,
The majority leader.
I ask unanimous consent the clerks be allowed to make technical corrections to the engrossing of amendments to SJ Res 68.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 384.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nomination.
Nomination, the judiciary, Robert Anthony Malloy of the Virgin Islands to be judge for the District Court of the Virgin Islands.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Robert Anthony Malloy of the Virgin Islands to be judge for the District Court of the Virgin Islands, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to executive session to consider calendar number 491.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. Or report the nomination.
Nomination, United States Tax Court, Travis Greaves of the District of Columbia to be a judge of the United States Tax Court.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22, what's the matter? Oh, you're right. The judiciary, Sylvia Corinna Cole of Puerto Rico to be United States District Judge for the District of Puerto Rico. Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22, the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the nomination of Sylvia Corinna Cole of Puerto Rico to be United States District Judge for the District of Puerto Rico, signed by 17 senators.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I move to proceed to legislative session.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to.
I move to proceed to calendar number 420.
Questions on the motion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Ayes appear to have it. Ayes do have it. Motion's agreed to. The clerk will report the nominee. The clerk will report the bill.
Counter number 420, S3275, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to protect pain-capable unborn children and for other purposes.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 420, S3275, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to protect pain-capable unborn children and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection.
I withdraw the motion and proceed.
The senator has that right.
I move to proceed to calendar number 17.
The clerk will report the motion to proceed.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 17, S311, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a health care practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or attempted abortion.
I send a cloture motion to the desk.
The clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 17, S311, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit health care practitioner from failing to